So good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We waited about 4 or 5 minutes after the normal start time just because we were watching and we could see some other folks coming onto the parking lot. We wanted to give them time to come on in. So first of all, let me say that I am really pleased by the large crowd that we have here tonight. We've got a lot of our members here at North Beach. We've got some folks that are visiting here from other congregations, and we have some folks that are visiting here from the community. We're really glad to see everybody here this evening. My name is Stephen Baxley. I'm the minister here at North Beach Church of Christ, so our members are used to seeing me in the pulpit because this is kind of where I camp out a good part of the time on Sundays. But for the rest of y'all don't know me from Adam tonight, but I am glad that you're here this evening. Just by way of a little background, as we get into this, one thing that I'd like to say about my own background is that although I'm a preacher, a minister, if you will, my educational background is that I have a bachelor's degree in history. So I didn't study theology. I didn't go to school to be a preacher. I actually went to school to study history. And so that's my background. It is not a background in archaeology. I will say that as well as we get into this. I am not an archaeologist. I don't play one on TV. I don't pretend to be one. But as a historian, these two fields of study intersect quite a bit. And so I feel, for the most part, in a non-technical way, able to handle the material that we're looking at this evening. Having said that, I am not an archaeologist, so I'm not able to handle the technical details, but I am able to go through and weigh the evidence as we see it come out in the archaeological record and how that ties in to history. Since we have so many folks visiting here this evening, I'd just like to point out that in the foyer we do have a water fountain, so if you get thirsty and you want something to drink and water's good, water's there. Feel free to get up in the middle of the lecture and go get a drink of water. That is not a problem. We also have restrooms here in the building. The men's restroom, as you go out of the auditorium and you go down that hall in front of us, the men's restroom is the first door on the right. Ladies' restroom is the first door on the left as you're walking down the hall. If for whatever reason those restrooms are full, we have two more way back at the back of the building. So if you just keep going down the hall, just don't go out the glass doors. If you go all the way down the hall, you'll see a men's restroom on the right and a ladies' restroom on the left. We will take a 10-minute break in the course of this lecture this evening. I was asked earlier when I thought that would be, and my answer was more or less, I don't know when that will be. It will be when we get to it in the lecture, because I didn't time the lecture out. I knew about where I think it would be. Put it there, have it there. We will have that, so we will have a 10-minute break where we can kind of stretch our legs and, of course, use the facilities if we need to. But if you're looking at your watch thinking, well, is it going to be at 7? I don't know, okay? It'll be sometime between now and 8. How about that? But it'll be probably about in the halfway mark. Also like to point out this evening that you may look at these mic cords that are hanging down from the ceiling. They are not mics that will pick you up if you have a question or a comment. So we have a young man, actually we have two young men who off and on this evening have a mic in their hands. And so if you have a question, I'll periodically stop and ask if there are any questions. And if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, they will come to you with the mic so that the mic can pick up the question that you have, and we will try, or I will try, to answer that here in the lecture. All right. So let's go ahead and get started this evening in looking at this topic of archaeology and the Bible. I have subtitled this lecture, How Ancient Artifacts Confirm and Illuminate Bible History. And I think that that's what we're going to do this evening. We're going to look at a lot of ancient artifacts. If you like to look at old things, you have come to the right place this evening, because we're going to look at lots of old things, some things that are really old. We're going to talk about them, and we're going to talk about them from the standpoint of their relevance to the Bible. That's what we're going to be doing this evening. But as we get into this, I think it's important for us to lay a little bit of groundwork, and so we can ask ourselves the question, what is archaeology? Archaeology has been defined on the website worldhistory.org as the study of the culture and history of past peoples and their societies by uncovering and studying their material remains. tools, ruins, and pottery. Archaeology and history are different subjects, but have things in common and constantly work with each other. That's a really good definition of archaeology. We should note that archaeology is not just carried out in the biblical world. Sometimes we think of archaeology and maybe we think about Indiana Jones with the hat and the whip and looking for the lost ark, okay? And that's all happening, at least in the early movies, that was all happening in the Middle East. Archaeology is actually carried out all over the world. I've seen archaeological digs and excavations taking place in Europe. I've seen one at Jamestown in Virginia. Pretty much any site that has some history to it, sooner or later, somebody who's an archaeologist is going to somehow get a grant, get funds to go and do an archaeological dig at that place. But we're not going to talk this evening about Jamestown or about Europe or even about Asia. We're looking this evening at archaeology from the standpoint of the Bible, the testimony, if you will, of biblical archaeology. When we talk about archaeology, again, just to lay some foundation work for what we're doing this evening, we need to understand that modern archaeologists have been active now for well over 100 years. I say that because, again, a lot of our ideas of archaeologists are, well, if you're my generation, you might be thinking Indiana Jones, where someone's out there looking for treasure. We probably all remember his first movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. And sometimes that's what we think is going on with archaeology. Well, I think archaeologists, by and large, would be happy with that idea that they're kind of superheroes of sorts. But most archaeologists, as a matter of fact, modern archaeologists, pretty much all of them, are not working in that way. Archaeology is a science. A lot of archaeology that took place over 100 years ago, the methods that were used are pretty much frowned on today for really good reason, because some of those sites were kind of disrupted and torn up a little bit as people went in and found some things. However, what those older archaeologists did for us is that they found some things in the archaeological record that sparked a lot of interest, and so really kind of gave birth to this study, this science of archaeology. As we talk about these kinds of discoveries, whatever they may be, we need to understand that discoveries can be subject to varying degrees of interpretation. So as you look at archaeology and you look at the things that are dug up, archaeologists will excavate a site, and then it will take years for their findings to be published. And when they finally publish their findings, there will inevitably be other archaeologists who come along and will look at the same data, and they will reach different conclusions. And so they will have different degrees of interpretation. Again, I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm trained as a historian. And one thing that we learned at the university, I went to a university that had a different approach to things. When we studied history, we never studied textbooks. I never had a history textbook in college. What I had was original documents. If we were studying the Reformation, we studied original documents. If we were studying the Roman Empire, we studied original documents. What was also pointed out to us is that historians disagree as well. And so there is, for example, communist history, Marxist history is what's technically called. That was kind of an eye-opener to me. Well, it's a Marxist interpretation of history. There are other schools of historical interpretation as well. Sometimes we have this idea that everything that happened in the past, well, it's clear what happened, so there isn't any discussion about that. Let me assure you that there is tons of discussion among historians about history. There is tons of discussion among archaeologists about how to interpret the data of the things that they have found. In fact, it is not unusual at all for archaeologists to disagree among themselves. And I will tell you this evening that there may be some of you who will disagree with some of my interpretations. That's okay. I would only ask that if you do go on the mic, that we keep any discussion at a civil level. Don't get heated about the disagreement. But I understand that there are different interpretations out there. I will also say in this lecture this evening, we just simply can't go into a lot of detail. And so you may raise your hand and you may have a comment or a question, and maybe you've been reading up on a particular archaeological find, and you may say some things about that, and I may look at you blankly because I have no idea exactly what it is you're talking about. If you see that blank look, that's simply my indication that I'm listening to you, but I'm not exactly sure about the data that you're giving me. The testimony of archaeology. Something else we should understand is that as we look at the lack of agreement among archaeologists, as we also look at the lack of corroboration between discovered remains and the biblical record, those two things do not mean that the Bible is inaccurate. In other words, when we look at archaeologists as they disagree among themselves as to whether this particular level of excavation dates to this year or this century or that century, that doesn't call in and of itself into question the biblical record, because again, archaeologists disagree even among themselves. It is also important for us to understand that just because there is a lack of corroboration between what we find and the biblical record, or the lack of evidence, that doesn't mean that the biblical record is wrong. Now, I will just throw this out here this evening. This is for free before we get to the lecture itself. There are some folks out there who have made the claim that they found Egyptian chariot wheels in the Red Sea. With all due respect and kindness in my heart, no, we haven't. Okay? We have not found Egyptian chariot wheels in the Red Sea. That has been completely and totally debunked. However, does that mean then that Pharaoh's army was not drowned in the Red Sea because we don't have chariot wheels? Absolutely not. Just because we don't have the remains of a chariot army buried under the Red Sea doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Lack of evidence does not mean that the Bible is inaccurate. That's important for us to understand. All right, let's look on a little bit farther at the testimony. As we look at archaeology, it's important for us to note that many discoveries illuminate the biblical record and the biblical world. Some, in fact, directly testify to biblical accuracy. But in any case, they illuminate this world that the Bible comes from. Share some quotes with you. This is from a man whose name was Nelson Glueck. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but he was an American rabbi and an archaeologist, and he lived from 1900 to 1971. And he stated that it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. He also said, in another quote, talking about the testimony of archaeology, the archaeological record, the almost incredibly accurate historical memory of the Bible, and particularly so when it is fortified by archaeological fact. In other words, he says that the Bible has an incredibly accurate historical memory. Now, I wouldn't say it that way, but that's the way he said it. And he said that even more so we see that when it is combined with archaeological facts. I'll share another quote with you, and this is going to take 2 slides. This individual, this is William F. Albright. He was an archaeologist as well, also a biblical scholar, also a philologist, and an expert on ceramics. And he said the excessive skepticism shown toward the Bible by important historical schools of the 18th and 19th centuries, certain phases of which still appear periodically, has been progressively discredited. He continues and says that discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history. Again, that's William F. Albright. John Montgomery said this. John Montgomery said, in talking about another individual, Thomas Drabina, he said, the American Institute of Holy Land Studies researcher Thomas Drabina cautioned that where archaeology and the Bible seem to be in tension, the issue is almost always dating, which is the most shaky area in current archaeology and the one at which scientific a priori and circular reasoning often replace solid empirical evidence. And indeed, when it comes to dating the archaeological record, that is where most archaeologists disagree among themselves, okay? And sometimes the dating of what is found in the archaeological record is indeed subjective. We would like things to be objective. Always. That's just the kind of people that we generally are as Americans. But the reality is, in the archaeological record, as in the historical record, sometimes what we find is actually pretty subjective. William Dever has this quote in his book, Has Archaeology Buried the Bible? He says, recent archaeological excavations have illuminated Philistine culture. Philistines were a people who lived in the Old Testament period. All of the somewhat cryptic information concerning the Philistines in the Hebrew Bible has proven correct, even though they are portrayed as the quote-unquote bad guys and are hardly the focus of the studies. And I will tell you that William Dever, even though he makes this admission in his book, William Dever is certainly, by no definition, a biblical fundamentalist. He would not look at the text of the Bible and say that it is always completely accurate. But he does give credit to the biblical history of the Philistines, these people that lived in the Old Testament period. F.F. Bruce says this. He says, for the most part, the service which archaeology has rendered to New Testament studies, and I would throw in there that counts for Old Testament studies as well, is in the filling in of the contemporary background against which we can read the record with enhanced comprehension and appreciation. Here at North Beach, I periodically teach a class called The Cultural World of the Bible. And a lot of the ways that we know about the cultural world of the Bible, which is very different from our culture today, is from the archaeological record. And so I see this firsthand, what F.F. Bruce talks about how these discoveries help us to understand that biblical world. All right, so what are we going to do tonight? Tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at artifacts that touch on various periods of Old Testament history. We're also going to have to limit ourselves a little bit, because originally when I put this together and we entitled it Archaeology in the Bible, I thought we would go all the way through to the New Testament period, except I was putting the lecture together and discovered very quickly that unless you want to stay here tonight till 9 o'clock, anybody want to stay here till 9 o'clock? Okay, I see some hands. Okay, definitely not the majority, and definitely not going to stay till 9 o'clock tonight. I had to shorten the lecture, and so I had to leave out the Hellenistic period, which is after the close of the Old Testament, before the beginning of the New Testament, and I had to leave out the New Testament as well. So the title of the lecture, Archaeology in the Bible, would have been better, Archaeology in the Old Testament. But you know, we already had the cards printed. We already did the Facebook event, and so I just kind of had to leave it where it was and give this mea culpa or caveat to what we're doing tonight. The reality is that we simply have no time to do that in this lecture. And I will also say that I am cognizant of the time. I will watch the time. I will not hold you past 8 o'clock, even if that means we have to cut the lecture short and we don't get to talk about everything that I want to talk about. Those of you who are members here at Beach, you know that I love to talk, okay? And I can talk on and on and on. My family knows that very well. I will try not to do that this evening as we talk about these things together. All right, so just to give us a little bit of an idea of what area we're talking about, this is a map of the Fertile Crescent. That green area there is what's called the Fertile Crescent. It stretches all the way from the Persian Gulf all the way across into Canaan. This is, for the most part, the biblical world, the world of the Old Testament at any rate. I've left Egypt off because it wasn't in the map, but I will just point out that Egypt is, of course, right over here. If the map continued on, Egypt would be over here somewhere on the wall. We will talk a little bit about a couple of artifacts from Egypt this evening, but by and large, the artifacts that we're looking at come from this area of the Fertile Crescent. It is called, at least it was called in the past, and I think it's still called that, the cradle of civilization. This is the part of the world where we have incredible civilizations over the last millennia that have arisen there. We have the Sumerians. If we talk about Hammurabi, maybe that name's familiar to us because he wrote a law code, and it was one of the first written law codes. This is that area. It is also the world of the Old Testament. And so this evening we're going to be focusing in on this geographical area, looking at some artifacts mostly, also looking at some sites as we go through. All right, so that's all introduction. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I've divided this up into some historical periods. The first period that we're going to look at is the period of the conquest and settlement of Canaan. This period dates From a biblical perspective, from 1400 to 1030 BC. So it's a period of about 400 years when Israel enters Canaan and settles in Canaan. And one of the sites, or one of the things that I think is really, really important to talk about, are the walls of Jericho. Jericho was the first city that was conquered when Israel crossed to the west side of the Jordan River. How do we know that? Because the Bible tells us that, okay? I will also tell you this evening, so that you understand exactly where I stand, I am a firm believer in the historical accuracy of the Bible, okay? So when I tell you this evening that Jericho was the first city conquered, that is coming from the biblical record. Jericho was a significant city. It was significant both because of its location. Jericho controlled the fords over the Jordan River. Where it was located, that city exercised control over the fords that would get you from east to west and west to east across the Jordan River. So it was significant for that reason. It was also significant because of its strength. We read about the conquest of Jericho partially. Well, we read about it in the book of Joshua. I'm only going to read part of this. So if you've got a Bible and you want to follow along, that's fine. Otherwise, I will just be reading this out loud when I get my Bible to cooperate. So Joshua chapter 6, we're going to read verses 1 through 5, and then we're going to drop down and read verse 20. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out, none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given you Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people will shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And the people shall go up, everyone straight before him. So God, in this text, gives Joshua his marching orders. This is how you're going to conquer the city of Jericho. And it is a very unconventional way to conquer a city. As a matter of fact, I don't think that they would teach this kind of battle plan at West Point or at the Naval Academy. But this is what God tells Joshua to do. If we drop down to verse 20 here in the same chapter, in verse 20 of the same chapter, so the people shouted, this is after they've done the marching around, so the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. So what the biblical account tells us is that the people are going to march around the city. That's how the city's going to be conquered. That's how the walls are going to fall down. But the walls are going to fall down flat, and they're going to fall down all the way around the city. So that the Israelites, the people of Israel who are now surrounding the city of Jericho, will simply be able to march up and over the wall into the city and conquer the city. What's interesting, beyond the fact that that is not a typical battle plan, what's interesting is how that ties in to what we find in the archaeological record in Jericho. This is a photograph of the mound of Jericho, ancient Jericho. If you were to go to this part of Israel today, there's a modern city of Jericho. That hill in the picture represents the ancient city of Jericho, the Jericho of the Old Testament. I will also tell you that the most famous excavator of Jericho, and there have been many, was a woman whose name was Kathleen Kenyon. She excavated Jericho in 1952 through 1958. But there have been lots of other archaeologists who have done work at Jericho since then. So we look at Jericho itself. That mound that you see in the picture covers about 9 acres, including fortifications. Now, we might look at that and we say, 9 acres, that's not a very big city. In the ancient world, that was a significant city, okay? To cover 9 acres on that mound meant that Jericho was an important city of the period. The mound itself also stands about 70 feet above the valley floor. So as you're looking at that, you see the buses there. Those are tour buses, people who have gone to see the remains of Jericho. The hill itself goes about 70 feet above the valley floor. The mound mostly consists of disintegrated mud brick from houses and walls. Okay, so as they look at that mound and as they're excavating in that mound, what they're finding is an awful lot of the remains of mud brick that has disintegrated. And again, there have been numerous excavations at Jericho since 1903. So this is a site that has been excavated over and over by various archaeologists with some things that have been found there. I'll give you an idea, an artist's rendition of ancient Jericho. This is towards the end of the Bronze Age, so it is the period of the conquest of Israel moving into Canaan or Palestine, if you will. And you will see that Jericho consisted of a lower city and an upper city. There were two walls, an inner wall and an outer wall. Then there was a revetment wall. A revetment wall was basically there to keep this first wall up, and then surrounding that was a ditch. These are significant fortifications in the ancient world. Most cities would not have had fortifications of this level and of this quality. Show another artistic rendition of what we've got going on here. This is kind of a cutaway view. So we have that stone retaining wall, that revetment wall. The ditch would have been out here. The mud brick wall, which is the outer wall, was 25 feet high. The inner wall was probably about 25 feet high, probably about the same height, but the stone retaining wall, the revetment wall being 12 feet high, and the wall itself being 25, that gets us to 36. So this wall, the bottom of this wall would have been, and it may not be clear in that, but it would have been higher than the outer wall of here. So people up here would have been able to see at least out beyond that wall. That was a double fortification system of Jericho. We see in this photograph, and by the way, there are lots of photographs from the excavations at Jericho. We see in this photograph the stone retaining wall, that revetment wall, on top of which was built that mud brick wall, which I can't point to you and show you where that is because it isn't there anymore. This part of the retaining wall is still there. The mud brick wall would have been built on top of this, okay, and it's not there today. Next photograph, this shows the mud brick collapse in front of the retaining wall. So here you have now a better view of what we're looking at. You have the stone retaining wall, that revetment, if you will, and then we have all of this mud brick remain here, more mud brick remain up here. It had all collapsed. It had all collapsed, and that's what they have found in the archaeological excavations. Our next photograph then shows that from another view, and I wanted to use this picture because it shows the scale a little bit. You got a couple of folks that are standing up there, and you've got all this mud brick down here. The stone retaining wall is still in place. All this mud brick, when it collapsed, covered all of that up. So now it's been excavated, so we see the stone retaining wall that's there, but all of this would have been the wall that was built on top of that stone wall, that retaining wall. What do we find in the biblical record? The statement is made in the book of Joshua that the walls fell flat. And that's what we see in the archaeological record, is that they collapsed down over that stone retaining wall. Which was important because, again, the Bible record also tells us that the Israelites were then able to enter the city from every direction. How do you do that when you've got a ditch and you've got a wall? Well, when the wall collapses, and it collapses everywhere, and it collapses flat, all of a sudden now you have something you can climb over to get into the city. A couple more photographs to share with y'all. This is of the burn layer in Jericho that's found in the excavations. If you look at that black line there, I hope you all can all see that from where you're sitting. Archaeologists find these things when they excavate cities. This is an indication that the city was burnt. That's the burn layer of Jericho in the excavations. Also found in the excavations of Jericho were these grain jars. And this is just one photograph of a couple. There were numerous that were found. Well, we might look at that and you might say, well, okay, great. So, when the city falls, you've got some grain jars there. Big deal. People had a lot of grain jars in their houses, right? It is a big deal because those grain jars were full of grain. And that's interesting and noteworthy because in the ancient world, armies fed off the cities that they conquered. So when they conquered a city, they would take whatever food they found because that's how they're going to feed their soldiers. They didn't have meals ready to eat like we have today that are shipped into the soldiers. They have to eat off the land. They have to live off the land. So a conquering army wouldn't just leave those jars there unless they had a good reason. The good reason that's given is, again, in the biblical record, Joshua is commanded that they are not to take the food of the city. Not only does it confirm the fact that that's exactly what they did, it also confirms the time frame. Because the book of Joshua has the conquest of Jericho in the spring. The spring after the harvest. So they had these crops. They had lots of crops in Jericho. The people of Israel are told, you leave them where they are. And so in the archaeological record, we have that burn layer because the city is burned. It's torched. And then we also have the grain jars with grain in them that were not taken by the Israelite army. So that's one bit of archaeological interest from that period. The other bit of evidence I'd like to share with y'all from this period, something that illuminates the biblical text, are the Amarna letters. If you've never heard of the Amarna letters, completely understandable. When it comes to archaeological artifacts, these are probably not the ones that most people think about. But the Amarna letters are actually pretty significant. It is an archive recorded on clay tablets. They are primarily diplomatic letters between Egypt and other rulers, including rulers in Canaan. They all date to about 1350 to 1330 BC. Okay? Now, without going into a lot of details about the dating, the conquest of Jericho, from a biblical standpoint, dates to about 1400 BC. That's when Israel enters Canaan. These letters are from various Canaanite cities to Egypt and back and forth. There are 382 known tablets. They may find some others later down the road, but at least as of today, they have 382 tablets from Amarna. They are housed in various museums around the world. So if you went to the British Museum in London, if you went to the museum, the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, or if you went to the Louvre in Paris, if you went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, as well as others, you might see some examples of the Amarna letters because they have been spread all over the world in these museums. The Amarna letters are written in Akkadian cuneiform, which was the language of diplomacy at this time. In Egypt, they're speaking Egyptian, and they have their own writing system. In Canaan, they're speaking Canaanite, and they have their own writing system. But the language of diplomacy is Akkadian, and it's written in cuneiform. And so as Egypt is writing to these cities, that's the language that they use. And the cities, when they write back to Egypt, they use that language as well. It's a little bit like today. Today, the language of diplomacy is English. 200 years ago, it was French. 1,000 years ago, it was Latin. At least in Europe, it was, at any rate. So sometimes a language is chosen as a language of diplomacy. Akkadian was at the time. What's interesting about the Amarna letters, and again, there are 382, but among these letters, there are no known letters from Jericho. Not a single one. There are other letters from other cities, not Jericho. From a biblical standpoint, that makes completely good sense. Because from a biblical standpoint, Jericho had already been destroyed. So there wasn't any city of Jericho at this point in time that could send letters to Egypt. This is what one of those Amarna letters look like. This is given the nomenclature EA299. They all have numbers so that you can identify which one you're looking at. That tablet has this inscription. And I know that's kind of small. That's the only way I can get it on one slide. So let me read that to you. To the King, my Lord, my God, the Son from the sky. Message of Yapahu, the ruler of Gazru. Let me just stop for a minute. Yapahu is the ruler's name. Gazru is not Gaza. It is Gezer, which was a city in Canaan. Okay? So, message of Yapahu, the ruler of Gazru, your servant. The dirt at your feet, the groom of your horses. Okay? This guy is really buttering the Egyptian pharaoh off. Okay? Up. Truly I fall at the feet of the King, my Lord, my God, my Son, the Son from the sky, 7 times and 7 times on the stomach and on the back. I have listened to the words of the messenger of the king, my lord, very carefully. May the king, my lord, the sun from the sky, take thought for his land. Since the Hapiru are stronger than we, may the king, my lord, give me his help, and may the king, my lord, get me away from the Hapiru, lest the Hapiru destroy us. The Hapiru there are the Hebrews. They're the Israelites. So here we have in this Amarna letter, the king of Gezer that has not fallen to the Israelites. And by the way, that's also exactly what the account of Joshua tells us. Gezer did not fall to the Israelites at the time of the conquest. He writes off to Egypt and he says, I'm groveling at your feet. We need help with these Hapiru, these Hebrews, these Israelites who have infested the land. Again, no Amarna tablets from Jericho. Here we have an Amarna tablet from Gezer, which the Bible said had not fallen. It's still ruled by a Canaanite king, and he's writing off to the Egyptian pharaoh saying, help me, because we're facing this threat from the Israelites. We have another artifact from this time period as well. It's called the Merneptah Stele. I'm sorry, I knew I was going to say that wrong tonight. Stele. It was discovered at Thebes in Egypt in 1896. It is today housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So if you go to Egypt, you go to Cairo, you can see this in the Egyptian Museum. It measures over 10 feet tall. I'm going to give you some of the measurements tonight because sometimes the photos don't really tell us how big those things are. But this particular stele measures over 10 feet tall. It is an inscription from a pharaoh whose name was Merneptah. That's why it's named after him. He's pharaoh from 1213 to 1203 BC. This particular artifact mostly chronicles Egypt's victory over invaders from Egypt. However, and this is what's important for us this evening, the last three lines of the stele reference a military campaign in Canaan, including a reference to Israel. It is also important to note that in the Egyptian writing, Israel is noted as a people, not a city-state. Sorry for the typo there. It is noted as a people, not a city-state. And so, as Merneptah is talking about Israel over there, it doesn't say they're a kingdom. It doesn't even say they're a city-state. It talks about them as a people. If you're familiar with the biblical record, you know that's exactly what we find with Israel during the conquest and settlement period. And by the way, Egyptian hieroglyphics make a distinction between a city and a people. All right, so here is that stele. It again is about 10 feet tall. And part of that, there at the bottom, says this: Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. What that means, and I kind of puzzled over that, what does it mean its seed is no more? Because I kind of understood that to be maybe they'd been wiped out. But the Egyptians, when they conquered a people, they wiped out their fields and their grain. Because people that don't have food have a really hard time raising an army and rebelling against Egypt. And so the Egyptians made an attack against these people, Israel, and it says they're laid waste, their seed is no more. What's interesting about this stele, this artifact, is that Israel was significant enough to be mentioned. It is one of the earliest mentions of Israel outside of the Bible. What is also significant is that there is no mention of a king, which is also important because the biblical record says Israel doesn't have a king during this time. It agrees with the biblical picture of Israel during the 1200s BC. So as we look at the biblical record, what it says about Israel and how they're existing, how they're moving into Canaan, how they're settling in Canaan, we see this Pharaoh over in Egypt who's led a campaign against that southern area of Israel, and he says Israel, not a city-state, but a people, they've been laid waste. It matches wonderfully with the biblical record. It illuminates what we find in the biblical record, if you will. All right, that is the period of the conquest. Let's move on and let's talk about our next period, which is the Assyrian period. The Assyrian period, I thought this was interesting as I was putting this together and putting the artifacts together that I chose to use. The majority of the artifacts we're going to talk about tonight come from this period, the Assyrian period. It dates roughly 900 to 600 BC, so about a 300-year period that we're looking at where Assyria is the dominant world power in the ancient Near East, okay? The Tel Dan Stele is the first of the ones that I want to talk about. This particular artifact was excavated at Tel Dan, which is in northern Israel. The fragments of this artifact were discovered in 1993 and 1994. So it is a relatively recent discovery. I know you can do the math and you say that's nearly 30 years ago. If you're real young, you say 30 years ago. I wasn't even born 30 years ago. For all the rest of us, 1993 and 1994 really isn't that long ago. The pieces that were discovered had been repurposed into an ancient stone wall. If you're living in the ancient world and you're building a stone wall, you can't go down to the Home Depot and buy a bunch of stone. So you find stone that you can use. And sometimes you find stone that you look at and you say, I don't care anything about that anymore. So we're going to use that to build this wall. People did that with tombstones in the ancient world as well. They would take tombstones and they would use them in part of their walls. Well, the pieces of this artifact had been repurposed in that way. Today, the Tel Dan Stele is housed at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So you're going to have to go to Israel to see the original. However, there is currently an exhibition in Oklahoma, in Edmond, Oklahoma. And if you wanted to see a copy of the Tel Dan Stele, you could go up there and see that. If you want more information about that, send me an email, and I will shoot you the information about that. All right, so let's look on at this particular artifact. It memorializes the victory of a king whose name was Hazael. He came from Syria. He reigns from 843 to 796 BC, and it commemorates his victory over two Jewish kings. The two Jewish kings are Joram or Jehoram, same guy, of Israel, and Ahaziah of, and this is what's significant, the house of David, which is Judah. We take our Bibles and go to 2 Chronicles. I'll do this for you if you don't have your Bibles here tonight. 2 Chronicles chapter 22. I'm going to read verses 2 through 9. We get the biblical account of this, and it coincides nicely with what's being described in this artifact. So 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 2, Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor in doing wickedly. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done. For after the death of his father, they were his counselors to his undoing. He even followed their counsel and went with Jehoram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, to make war against Hazael, king of Syria, at Ramoth Gilead. And the Syrians wounded Joram, and he returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds that he had received at Ramah, when he fought against Hazael, king of Syria. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel, because he was wounded. But it was ordained by God that the downfall of Ahaziah should come about through his going to visit Joram. For when he came there, he went out with Jehoram to meet Jehu, the son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had appointed to destroy the house of Ahab. And when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he met the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who attended Ahaziah, and he killed them. He searched for Ahaziah, and he was captured while hiding in Samaria. And he was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said, he is the grandson of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom. All right. Well aware. Read a text like that, lots of big names, easy to get lost in that, okay? The divided kingdom period of Israel is a pretty complex period of history. It is, the overall period is the Assyrian period, okay? So Hazael says, I waged war against these kings. Hazael claims to have defeated these kings. This is the Tel Dan Stele in that photo. The inscription says this, and I killed two powerful kings who harnessed 2,000 chariots and 2,000 horsemen. I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Joram, king of the house of David. And if you will look there in that red circle, that is the word that's significant, the house of David. He doesn't say Judah. He says the house of David. That's significant because it confirms the war recorded in 2 Chronicles 22 that we just read. We get more details in the Bible, but Hazael is talking about the same events. Hazael claims to have killed Joram and Ahaziah, and from his perspective, he did. He's not the one that actually kills them, but he waged war against them, and then someone else actually kills them. But from his perspective, he defeated them. This artifact is the earliest evidence for the house of David, which is itself evidence for the existence of King David. Because, see, that's a controversial thing to say. Because in the archaeological world, there's a whole argument going on about whether there was even a King David. If you believe the Bible, you know there was a King David, because the Bible record talks about him extensively. But historically, we didn't have references to King David. And this isn't a reference to King David. It is, however, a reference to the house of David. You can't have a house of David if there wasn't a David to start the house. See where I'm going with this? That's why the Tel Dan Stele is important. That's why in 1993 and 1994, when this was discovered and it was deciphered, it ignited a storm of controversy. Because you had a lot of folks saying there was never a David. This has got to be a fake. But it was discovered in an archaeological excavation. And that's important. It's been deciphered by people that can decipher these kinds of inscriptions. And we have a reference to the house of David, giving us a reference to King David, if you will. These are all from that period. Let's look on here. I need to look real quick at my time. Okay. We're going to have a break. I'm betting about 15, 20 minutes. Okay? And by the way, the second half will not be as long as the first. So I'll just throw that out there as well. Let's talk a little bit about a guy whose name was Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser III was king of Assyria from 859 to 824 BC. I hope everybody's taking notes. There'll be a test on this at the end, right? Okay, no. King of Assyria from 859 to 824 BC. He fought battles which significantly increased the power and prestige of Assyria. This guy was really important for the Assyrians, okay? Two monuments that we're going to talk about this evening mention two kings from the Old Testament, and they date to this guy's reign. That's why he is important, and that's why we're going to talk about him just briefly here. A couple of photographs here. It's interesting, I think, when we get to see what some of these guys look like or apparently look like. These are statues of Shalmaneser. I will tell you, if you want to see these with your own eyes, you're going to have to go to Baghdad, to Iraq, because they are housed in the Iraq Museum. I'm not sure that's a real good idea. I'm not sure I'd recommend that. So I give you these photographs this evening. Very typical looking Assyrian statue. That's Shalmaneser III. The first artifact that we have from this guy is called the Shalmaneser III Stele. You'll see that word a lot, okay? It was discovered in 1861 by British archaeologist John George Taylor in Kirk, Turkey, which in the ancient world had been apparently part of Assyria. It is 87 inches tall, 34 inches wide, 9 inches deep. So if I had to kind of measure that out, 87, I'm probably, let's say I might be about my size, about 87 inches tall, about 34 inches wide. A little bit deeper than 9 inches though, because I have eaten too many meals in my life. This particular stele is currently housed at the British Museum. So at least in this regard, you can see something a little bit easier. If you go to London, you can go to the British Museum and see this particular artifact. That's where it is housed. It is inscribed in cuneiform, which are those funny wedgie characters that Akkadian and other languages were written in this period. As we look at this particular artifact, the stele, it is a chronicle. Sorry about that. It is a chronicle of military campaigns in western Mesopotamia and Syria, and it describes a battle at a place called Karkar, which was fought in 853 BC. This is a significant battle in the ancient world. However, it is not mentioned in Scripture. So if you're looking for the Battle of Karkar in the Bible, you will not find it. This particular stele mentions Ahab of Israel as a member of the anti-Assyrian coalition. So let me pull up a photograph of that stele. You can't see the inscription very well, but it's got inscription all over it down here as well. And what we find in the inscription is part of it at any rate is this: to Karkar I drew near. Karkar, his royal city, I destroyed. I devastated. I burned with fire. 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, 20,000 soldiers of Hadad-ezer of Aram. That would be Syria. And then we have a section that describes other coalition members. Let's get down to the parts important for us. 2,000 chariots, 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. And then there's a mention of other coalition members. I battled with them. From Karkar as far as the city of Gilzal, I routed them. That's significant for us as well. Because lots of folks come to the Old Testament and they say, it's just made up. It's all a story, nothing more. Those guys didn't really exist. Those kings didn't really exist. And here we have Shalmaneser III making this stele to commemorate what he does and commemorate the Battle of Karkar. And he mentions who? Ahab of Israel. And in fact, even gives us details about the size of his contingent in that coalition. Does it confirm a fact in the Bible? No, because the Battle of Karkar isn't even mentioned in the Bible. Does it confirm a king of Israel? Absolutely, Ahab. Let's look at the other artifact that comes from Shalmaneser III. This is called the Black Obelisk. Okay, I love that name, the Black Obelisk. Sounds very mysterious, doesn't it? It was discovered in 1846 by British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard in Nimrud, Iraq. It is 6.5 feet tall. Each side is 1.5 feet wide. So taller than me, and it is a rectangle prism, if you will, an obelisk. It's currently housed at the British Museum. You will see the British Museum pop up several times this evening because there's lots of artifacts there. If you ever get to London, add an extra day to your trip and go to the British Museum if you're interested in these things. It is inscribed in cuneiform, and it is significant for its mention of Jehu of Israel and apparently his depiction. So this is the Black Obelisk. That's what it looks like. Replicas of this, excuse me, can be seen in the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. That's in Chicago, so you can go to Chicago and see a replica of it. You can go to Harvard's Museum of the Ancient Near East in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You can see another replica of it. If you want to see the original, you got to go to London and see it there in the British Museum. All right, so let's get a close-in view of this. This is the part that's important for us. The inscription says this: I received the tribute of Jehu, son of the people of the land of Omri. Silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, tin, a staff for a king, and spears. And here you have the Assyrians receiving tribute from apparently Jehu, depicted here in this obelisk. Now, maybe it is Jehu's emissary. Maybe Jehu didn't go personally to do that. The language of the obelisk would allow one or the other. But what's important is Jehu is mentioned and Omri is mentioned as being a king in Israel. Jehu being a king in Israel. This is important. Now I will say this. Jehu was not actually from the house of Omri. Okay? But the house of Omri, that dynasty, had been so powerful that among people around Israel, they took that as a synonym for Israel. So when they talked about Israel, they said, those are the people of Omri over there. Plus, quite honestly, the Assyrians probably really didn't care exactly who Jehu's father was, but they mentioned Jehu in the obelisk. So 2 of these artifacts from the reign of Shalmaneser III. We also have some other things to talk about. I want to talk just a little while about the Hezekiah and Isaiah seal impressions. These were excavated in Jerusalem. They were excavated near the Temple Mount in 2009. They were, however, not deciphered until 2015. That's really recent, okay? That's less than 10 years ago that these were deciphered. They're excavated. They found them. They find all sorts of artifacts when they're doing a dig. Then they have to go in and decipher and figure out what things are. So there's a little bit of a gap there. The person who discovered them was a woman whose name was Dr. Eilat Mazar. She was an Israeli archaeologist. She is deceased now. We'll see a picture of her in just a moment. These seal impressions are clay seals that were used to secure strings that had tied a document or sacks and were often very, very small, about 1/2 inch. So, looking at these a little bit farther. Both of these seal impressions date to the 8th century BC. which biblically speaking is the time of Hezekiah and Isaiah. They bear the inscriptions of King Hezekiah, who reigns from 715 to 686, as well as his contemporary, the prophet Isaiah. All right, this is where they're excavated. They were excavated in what's called the Ophel area, outside, well, it's not outside of Jerusalem, it's in metropolitan Jerusalem, but you see up there the Temple Mount, okay, in Jerusalem, very famous, site up here, the Golden Dome. Dr. Eilat Mazar, who lived 1956 to 2021, was the one that discovered these seals. Her archaeological dig discovered these seals. She comes from a long line of archaeologists. Her grandfather was a famous Israeli archaeologist, and her uncle was a professor at one of the important universities in Jerusalem. The seals look like this. This is one of them. This particular seal has the inscription belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And that is exactly what the Bible tells us about Hezekiah. Belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And of course you have some icons there that are on that seal, and the inscription marks it as his. The second of these is this one. This one says, belonging to Isaiah the prophet. Okay, and it is a partial, it is not complete. That particular seal was used to seal a linen bag based on the impressions on the opposite side. These were made out of clay. So when they're stuck on something, they get the impressions on it, all right? And this particular one had sealed a linen bag. So picture a bag made out of linen, maybe filled with grain or something else. It belongs to Hezekiah, so it's tied off, and he puts a seal on it. It's evidence against tampering, okay? It's an ancient firewall or antivirus program, if you will, so that you can be sure that what's in there actually belongs to you. Now, I will tell you that part of the inscription, the prophet, is some matter of debate. The last letter was smudged by the fingerprint. However, the evidence is strongly in favor of the reading the prophet. Now, let me just throw this out there. So I always think things like this are interesting. If you look at that, there's a fingerprint apparently in this part of it. That letter is smudged. This would be the letter, this would be the part that would read prophet. Remember, Hebrew is right to left. That's the letter that's missing. That's where the argument is over whether it's prophet or whether it's something else. It's really strong in favor of prophet. If this is indeed Isaiah the prophet, we may very well have his fingerprint on the seal. I don't like to be sensational, but it's his linen bag. It's his seal. I'd like to think that probably it's Isaiah that's sealing that and making sure that's sealed. Lest this be too far-fetched. Many years ago, I lived in the Czech Republic. My wife is Czech, and I did her family history. And family history means delving into church books. These were the actual books. It wasn't like today where everything's done on a computer. These were the actual church books. When someone was born, the priest, the village priest, entered that information into those books in his handwriting. When people were married, that was entered in the priest's handwriting. And then over in one of the columns was a place for the father of the child to sign his name, or the witnesses to the wedding to sign their names. As I was doing her genealogy, I found the signatures of her great-great-great-grandparents in the record, written in their own hand, in a book that at that time I was actually able to hold in my hands. So seeing things like this in the historical record, in the archaeological record, really isn't all that surprising. And by the way, this is really, really tiny. This was on exhibit also in Edmond, Oklahoma several years back, and I was kind of expecting something about that big, like a coin. You can see that pretty easily. At the exhibit, they had it under glass, and they had a magnifying glass for you to use to look at it, because it is so tiny. I've always thought of these things as being big. They're actually very, very small. So when we put them together, Hezekiah and Isaiah, these two seals were found 10 feet apart in the same layer of excavation. They're mentioned together, Hezekiah and Isaiah, mentioned together in the same verse of the Bible 16 times. And we see here in this archaeological dig, this excavation, their seals right there in close proximity to each other. All right, let's talk a little while about Sennacherib. Sennacherib is another Assyrian king. He's king of Assyria from 705 to 681 BC. He is one of the most powerful of Assyria's kings. He led a campaign against Judah in 701 BC, some of which is recorded in the Bible. One of the things that Sennacherib did was he conquered the city of Lachish. Hezekiah had stopped paying tribute to Assyria in 705 BC. The Assyrians don't come until 701. Hezekiah stops paying tribute. I'm not paying taxes to the Assyrians anymore. This is described in the Bible, 2 Kings 18, 7 and 8. We're not going to read that because I want to get us to that break here pretty quick. Sennacherib, of course, isn't buying that. You don't stop paying taxes to the guy who rules the world. So he moves south through the region. Judah wasn't the only city that rebelled. There were others as well, or the only nation that rebelled. He subdues several other rebellious nations. And then he lays siege to Lachish, which was Judah's second most important city. That is described also in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 13 through 16. I'm going to pull up a map to kind of show you what's going on here. So, the Assyrians, this whole area is under Assyrian overlordship. Assyria is way up here off the map. Samaria is here. By the way, at this point in time, Samaria is an Assyrian province. They've been conquered by the Assyrians. So Judah is kind of the border. You've got the Philistines over here. Remember, we talked about them earlier. Lachish is down here. Jerusalem's over here, up in the hills. So the Assyrians come down. They don't go straight to Jerusalem. Instead, they go to Lachish. Well, if you studied military history, or you've been to the Naval Academy or West Point, you may understand exactly what the Assyrians are doing. Because way down here off the map are the Egyptians, and they are not a part of the Assyrian Empire. So as Sennacherib comes down, he's not going to move against Jerusalem directly, because then you've got Lachish, which is the second most important city, to his rear, along with the Egyptians. So that's concerning. So we're going to get rid of Lachish first, and only then are we going to move against Jerusalem. We're going to make sure that our rear area is protected. This is a photograph of Tel Lachish, what's left of Lachish today. Some things that you will note there on the photograph. There is the outer gate and the inner gate. It had a double gate complex. There is the Assyrian siege ramp and the Iron Age palace. So the palace here dates to the time of the Assyrian attack. This is the siege ramp that the Assyrians built. Another photograph showing you the siege ramp. That's it right there. It was hard to get up to Lachish. We want to conquer Lachish. We're going to use battering rams and war machines. And so we're going to build a ramp to get up there. This is the only siege ramp that has been excavated in the ancient Near East. And in excavating it, they found more than 1,000 iron arrowheads, as well as part of a chain used for catching the battering rams as they're hammering against the walls of Lachish. This particular relief, the next picture I'm going to show you, what are called the Lachish reliefs, this describes graphically that battle. The Lachish reliefs were uncovered during the 1845 to 1847 excavations of the Palace of Nineveh, which today is in Iraq. It is currently housed at the British Museum. See, all of y'all right now are planning a trip to London, if you like these things, because you get to see a lot of them if you go to London, all right? So it's currently housed at the British Museum. It measures 17 by 39 feet. It's really, really big, okay? 39 feet across, 17 feet high, these Lachish reliefs. They give us some information about what the Bible tells us about the siege of this city. Here we have a part of that. There is Sennacherib himself being depicted on these Lachish reliefs. And the inscription says this: Sennacherib, the mighty king, king of the country of Assyria, sitting on the throne of judgment before the city of Lachish. I give permission for its slaughter. And the Assyrians slaughtered Lachish. The city fell. It was defeated. A lot of its people were killed, and a lot of others were carried off into captivity. So in this part of the relief, we have some things that we note. And I realize this is hard to see. Some of this is hard to see on purpose. We have the battering rams going up the siege ramp that we just saw in that photograph a little while ago. We have some slingers over here. We don't think of the slingshot as a military weapon in the ancient world. It was a significant military weapon. It was just as important as archers. There are archers all over the place in the picture. And this is why, purposely, I didn't leave it in big detail, because down here the Assyrians have got some prisoners that they're impaling in front of the city walls. Because that's what the Assyrians did. They would come to a city, lay siege to it. They would drag some unfortunate souls that they had captured at the previous city, and they would impale them in full view of the people of the city they were now attacking. And the message to the city was, if you surrender, we won't do this to you. But of course, if the city surrendered, and they very seldom ever did, that's exactly what the Assyrians did to them. They took some of them off to the next city to impale them. These folks were the ISIS of the ancient world. They were horrific in how they dealt with anybody who rebelled against them. Another photograph of the Lachish reliefs. Here we have slingers and archers, all of those soldiers that are carrying out the battle against Lachish. And then finally, in this photograph, we have these survivors that are taken into captivity. So, these are depictions of people of Judah being carried off into captivity. And it matches, again, what we find in the biblical record. The Bible talks about the fact that they lay siege to the city. We see in this particular case that Sennacherib commemorates this. He goes back, and in his palace, he has these artists build this thing so that everybody, I mean, think about this. Everybody that comes visit Sennacherib in his palace, they walk past that. Oh, look at those people being impaled. Look at those people being carried off into captivity. The message, don't mess with Sennacherib. It will not end well for you. Okay? We are not the first people who came up with propaganda and came up with political cartoons. People have been doing this for a very long time. All right, we're going to stop right there. This is our slide for a break. So we're going to take 10 minutes. I will watch my clock. So it's 7:09, almost 7:10. 7:20, we're going to pick up and continue on. We are well past the halfway mark. Restrooms and water fountain are out there if you need to do that. And I'm just going to turn off my mic, and I'll kind of stick around up here if you want to come up and talk to me. We're talking about the Assyrian period. That's the period that we're in. And we're still in that period. It really is interesting to me how many of the artifacts that we have come from the Assyrian period. So we looked at the Lachish reliefs. The Lachish reliefs definitely illuminate what goes on when the Assyrians invade Judah. We also, though, have some artifacts, or an artifact that's important because it tells us a little bit about what happens with Jerusalem. Because Sennacherib conquers Lachish. Lachish is not his main goal. He has to pacify Lachish in order to be able to conquer Jerusalem. So he now is conquering Lachish. He wants to get rid of Jerusalem as well. Hezekiah had paid tribute to Assyria. He had decided this not paying taxes is not a real great idea. So he tries to buy the Assyrians off. And he sends a pretty significant amount of tribute to Sennacherib. Sennacherib takes the tribute, and apparently he says, that's nice. That made it easier, but you know what? You're still going to have to surrender completely. And so he's going to try to come against the city of Jerusalem. An embassy is sent to Jerusalem. This is recorded in the books of Isaiah, 2 Kings, and 2 Chronicles. The Bible talks about this in 3 different places. It's concerning to Hezekiah. It's concerning to Hezekiah because the Assyrian army is the most powerful army in the ancient world at this time. They've taken Lachish, and now they're coming against the city. Hezekiah takes this issue, biblical record tells us, takes this issue to God, and God miraculously delivers the city. We're going to read this text. We're going to take our Bibles, or I'm going to take my Bible, and read Isaiah chapter 37, and I'm going to read verses 33 through 37. It's important for us to get what the Bible says about what happens. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return. And he shall not come into this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake, and for the sake of my servant David. And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. So the Bible tells us that the Assyrians taken the city of Lachish. They're now coming up, they're planning to come up against the city of Jerusalem. Hezekiah takes it before God. God's answer to that is, you don't need to worry about this, Hezekiah. I'm going to defend the city. The Bible tells us that God sends a plague against them, and 185,000 are killed. He goes out and he strikes down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. That would be a significant defeat for any army to lose that many people. Sennacherib, the Bible tells us, goes back to Nineveh. Don't have an army, can't conquer the city. What's interesting about that is Sennacherib remains king for some time after this. He's going to reign, I think, for another 20 years or so after the events at Jerusalem. He lives long enough to record his history. So we have copies of Sennacherib's annals. His histories, if you will. That's simply what that word means. They are inscribed on various prisms. 3 of the most significant of these are now housed at the British Museum in London, the ISAC in Chicago, and the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. They're all pretty much identical. What's interesting about that is if you don't have the ability to go to London or Israel, you can go to Chicago, catch a baseball game, eat a couple of hot dogs, and go to the ISAC, and you can actually see not a copy, but one of these original prisms. They were created in 689 and 691 BC, and they all pretty much look like this one. This particular one is the one from London, and the inscription on all these is virtually the same. The inscription says this, the part that's significant for us. As for Hezekiah, first note, name of a king of Judah, inscribed outside of the Bible. That's significant. As for Hezekiah the Judahite, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small towns in their area, which were without number, by leveling with battering rams, and by bringing up siege engines, and by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels, and breaches, I besieged and took them. And indeed, the Assyrians laid waste to Judah. He claims 46 walled cities, plus a lot of other lesser cities. No reason to doubt that, okay? Hezekiah himself, the text continues, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. Notice with me, if you will, that Sennacherib commemorates the fall of Lachish in the reliefs. He doesn't celebrate the fall of Jerusalem. In his prisms, he celebrates the fall of all these other cities, but he doesn't celebrate the fall of Jerusalem because Jerusalem didn't fall. The Bible tells us that, and he doesn't claim anything other than that. All he claims is that I shut up Hezekiah in the city like a bird in a cage. It's propaganda, but it's careful propaganda. Because there would have been a whole lot of folks that would have known, we didn't conquer Jerusalem, so why are you writing that on these prisms? That's Sennacherib, okay? The Lachish reliefs, these prisms. Again, you can go see one in Chicago if you can't get to either of the other 2. Another inscription or artifact, if you will, from this period is called the Siloam inscription. It's an inscription in Hebrew. It was created during Hezekiah's reign. Okay? It was found by a 16-year-old. So young people, don't count yourself short. Young people have done lots of significant things. Found by a 16-year-old whose name was Jacob Eliyahu while exploring Hezekiah's tunnel. This particular inscription was eventually relocated to Istanbul, to the Istanbul Archaeology Museum by the Ottoman government, which is where it is today. So if you want to see it, you're going to have to go to Turkey, you're going to have to go to Istanbul, and you're going to have to convince someone there to show it to you because it's not on display. This is a source of contention between Turkey and Israel today because it has no significance to Turkey. It has a lot of significance to Israel. Israel wants it back. Turkey says, no, we're keeping it, even though we don't have it on display. So the Siloam inscription, what can we say about it? It describes the construction of the tunnel, of Hezekiah's tunnel. Hezekiah built this tunnel to divert water from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam. This is described in a couple of verses in the Bible. We're going to look at these. The first of those is 2 Kings chapter 20 and verse 20. 2 Kings 20 and verse 20, the rest of the deeds of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And then in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, starting in verse 2, and when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. A great many people were gathered, and they stopped all the springs and the brook that flowed through the land, saying, "Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water?" He set to work resolutely and built up all the wall that was broken down, and raised towers upon it. And outside it he built another wall, and he strengthened the Millo in the city of David. He also made weapons and shields in abundance, and he set combat commanders over the people and gathered them together to him in the square at the gate of the city, and spoke encouragingly to them, saying, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." And the people took confidence from the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Now we saw in the text of the Bible that when God delivers the city, he does that by striking the Assyrians himself. We see the Assyrians, they leave. They don't conquer the city of Jerusalem. No explanation given. Not hard to figure out why. Probably wouldn't want to explain why you failed to take the city of Jerusalem. But what you see in these texts is that Hezekiah knew you trust in God, but you do what? The old saying was, trust in God, but keep your powder dry, right? You may remember that if you're a little bit older generation. Trust, but be prepared. So he trusts in God, but he's still preparing the city of Jerusalem for a siege, and it involves the water. He increases Jerusalem's supply of water during the time of the Assyrian aggression. He also eliminates some of the water that the Assyrians would use for their army if they are, in fact, besieging the city. This is a picture, the next photograph here is a picture of the Gihon Spring. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can go see the Gihon Spring. It is still there. It is still an active spring. It's an interesting spring in that it gushes, okay? Apparently that Hebrew word Gihon means gushing, all right? I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but that's apparently what it means. That it's kind of like Old Faithful. Old Faithful blows up every however many minutes it is. The Gihon Spring pushes out water every so many hours, I guess, that there's a new flow of water. But it still produces water today. It is significant if you examine what the city of Jerusalem looks like at this time. So you've got the Gihon Spring, which is outside the old walls of Jerusalem. You've got a pool over here. What Hezekiah does is he extends the walls to encompass the Gihon Spring. There's a water gate there, okay? And the spring itself has a building built on top of it. But that still puts the water pretty close to the edge of the town. We want to get the water somewhere else. So in addition to doing this, he diverts the Gihon Spring so that it will carry water to this pool. The problem with that is there's no tunnel to get it there. So he's going to have a tunnel built. And that's what he does. Next photograph, diagram here, kind of a little bit different view of the city of Jerusalem. Again, you have this gate over here. The spring is in this area. The pool that it's diverted to is over here. Okay, so the water from the spring is going to be brought down here so the people of Jerusalem will have access to it during a siege. And so the Assyrians will not. This is Hezekiah's tunnel, part of it. Give you an idea. Again, I chose this photograph because you've got this guy, he's probably a student in Jerusalem, and he's walking in the tunnel. You can walk in the tunnel, apparently. I have never been there. I've never seen it with my own eyes. But apparently you can walk in the tunnel. You don't have to worry about drowning because it doesn't ever get very high. The water doesn't. So he's walking in the tunnel. This was where they found the Siloam inscription. It was there in the stone wall, and it was taken off. Okay, and broken up when it did. This is the Siloam inscription, and you can see that it's broken up. It's in pieces that have been put back together, and it's been deciphered from Hebrew. This is the transcription. This is about the tunneling. Okay, This is the narrative of the tunneling. While the stone cutters were wielding the picks, each toward his co-worker, the picks, each toward his co-worker, and while there were still 3 cubits to tunnel through, the voice of a man was heard calling out to his co-worker, because there was a fissure in the rock running from south to north. And on the final day of tunneling, each of the stone cutters was striking the stone forcefully so as to meet his co-worker, pick after pick. And then the water began to flow from the source to the pool, a distance of 1,200 cubits. A cubit is about 18 inches. And 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stone cutters. So apparently, as they're doing this tunnel, if you're digging a tunnel from one direction, it's slower. We've got the Assyrians breathing down our neck. We got to do this quick. So they are digging from 2 different directions, and they more or less meet in the middle. I say more or less meet in the middle because it's clear from the tunnel that they kind of were off a little bit and had to redirect to get there. But given the time period that this is happening, that shouldn't surprise us. This is a description of what the Bible tells us is happening in Hezekiah's reign. Significant artifact from that period. All right, that brings us to the last period of Bible history that we're going to talk about tonight, and that is the Babylonian period. This is 620 to 539 BC. You may notice that is a very short period of time because the Babylonian Empire does not rule over the area for nearly as long as the Assyrians did, and then they're knocked off by the Persians. We're going to get to the Persians a little bit briefly tonight as well. We talk about the Babylonian period. One thing that we find in this period that I think is really, really fascinating are some seal impressions from the time of Jeremiah. There were 3 particularly important prophets during this period, the last days of the kingdom of Judah. Not the Assyrians now, it's the Babylonians that are the problem. Jeremiah is one of them, Ezekiel is another, and Daniel. Jeremiah's book, the book that he writes, mentions quite a few individuals in Jerusalem, as do other historical records in Scripture from this time. So you remember the Hezekiah and Isaiah seals? Right? Okay. They are not unique. There are lots of seals that are found, lots of seals that belong to people who we have no idea who those people were. Okay? Some, however, coincide with biblical names. So, for example, here's one. This is the seal, not the seal, let me say that differently. This is the clay seal, the clay impression of a fellow whose name was Gemariah, who was the son of Shaphan. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 36 and verse 10. This particular seal was excavated in 1982 by Israeli archaeologist Professor Yigal Shiloh in an archaeological excavation. Didn't show up on the antiquities market. Anytime something shows up on the antiquities market, it's a little bit suspect. This one shows up in a dig. Jeremiah 36 and verse 10 talks about this guy, mentions him. Here we have a clay impression from his seal, from his signet. Then we have another fellow, Gedaliah, son of Pashur. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 38 and verse 1. And we're not going to read these texts because generally they're just a listing of names, okay? And don't really help us out a whole lot for understanding what these guys are about. But these are people that are alive in Jeremiah's time. They're mentioned in his book. This particular seal is excavated in 2007 by Dr. Eilat Mazar, who we talked about earlier. That's pretty recent. 2007 is a pretty recent date. Then we have another seal. This is from Jehukal, son of Shelemiah. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 37 and verse 3. It's excavated in 2005, also by Dr. Eilat Mazar. What I think is fascinating about this is we have Jeremiah writing his book, and he's talking about people that are interacting with him, interacting with what's going on in Judah. They're mentioned by name, and then in these excavations, we get evidence that these people really existed. It isn't a fairy tale. He doesn't make up names. He uses names and he talks about people that all of his contemporaries probably would have heard about to some extent or another. And we find evidence of them in the archaeological record. To belabor the point, and I am belaboring the point on purpose, we have others. This particular seal is from Azariah, son of Hilkiah. This is mentioned, he's mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 10 and 11. He's also mentioned in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 1. Let's see, let's read 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 10 and 11. of the priests. Jediah, Jehoram, Jachin, well, lots of names here. And Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, is mentioned in that listing of the priests. And here we have the clay impression of a seal. Excavated 1982, again, in a controlled excavation by Professor Yigal Shiloh. Then we have another inscription. This is Nathan Melech, servant of the king. He's mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 11. And then we have a stone seal of a man whose name was Icar. He was the son of Mattaniah, who's mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 24 and verse 17. The difference between these two, this is the clay that was used to seal. The ring would have put that impression in it. This is the actual stone seal that would have made the impression. In archaeological excavations, they find these and they find these. They probably find more of these than these because each signet ring would have made multiples of these. Okay? These two items were excavated in 2019. That's really recent. 2019 by Professors Yuval Gadot and Dr. Yiftach Shalev. And I'll hopefully have not butchered their names too horribly much. Azariah, he lived during the final years of the kingdom of Judah. Nathan Melech, he lives during the time of Josiah, so not quite as late. Icar, his father was Mattaniah. Mattaniah was the name of the king who Nebuchadnezzar renamed as Zedekiah. So that fella is probably from the royal family. And then we have this interesting artifact. This is an actual ring with the stone seal still in it. It's Hanan's. And if you're wondering right now who in the world is Hanan, I'd like to know who he was too. This particular ring with the seal emerged on the antiquities market. It was not discovered in an archaeological dig. Generally speaking, that makes it suspect. Okay? It appears in the antiquities market. It's the ring. You can see that. Okay, we're looking at it, looking down at the ring. There's the seal, the stone seal in it. That would have been stamped in clay. Hanan. The inscription says Hanan, son of Hilkiah. Does that sound familiar? We just read about him. Okay? Hilkiah the priest. We read about his son Azariah. We don't read about his son Hanan, but the inscription says Hanan, son of Hilkiah. This Hanan is unknown in Scripture. Azariah is known. There's a seal. And it has been reasonably shown that the same craftsman that created the seal that created that is the same craftsman that created that. How do we know? Because the handwriting's the same, if you will. My wife, when she, if you've ever seen her handwriting, you'll appreciate this. She writes a shopping list, and it's in code. She doesn't want me to go do the shopping. She likes to do the shopping. So when she writes a shopping list, she knows I will never be able to read what's on there. She could have been a doctor in another life. Okay? But I can pick her handwriting out in a heartbeat. People that can decipher these languages, which is Hebrew in this particular case, they can recognize the handwriting. And so they recognize that the same guy that makes this seal is the same guy that made that, the seal that created that clay. Okay? So who's Hanan? Not mentioned in Scripture. Now, here's the thing. If I'm a forger, if I want to create an artifact that then I'm going to sell for a lot of money on the antiquities market, because the antiquities market has a lot of stuff for sale. Look on eBay sometime. Probably 90 to 95% of what's on eBay is fake. But people still buy it because they want a piece of history. So if I'm going to create something that's a fake, I'm not going to make a ring that says Hanan, who's not even in the Bible. I'm going to make a ring that says what? Azariah, son of Hilkiah. Or I'm going to make a ring that says Hezekiah, king of Judah. Or I'm going to make a king, if I really want to sell it for a lot of money, I'm going to make a ring that says David, king of Judah. and I'll get for that whatever I ask. What that tells us is that is most likely not a forgery. That it is a real artifact mentioning somebody that just happens to not be mentioned in the scriptures. All right, Persian period, and this will be the last little section that we talk about this evening. The Persian period goes from 550 to 530 BC, biblically speaking. That's the wrong date. I'm sorry. 530 is not right. 330. 550 to 330 BC, so there's a typo there. Persian period, after the Babylonians fall to the Persians, the people of Israel come under the rule of the Persian Empire. And one of the important artifacts is what's called the Cyrus cylinder. King Cyrus of Persia, Cyrus the Great, takes the city of Babylon in 539 BC. We talked about this in a previous lecture. Cyrus, however, took a radically different approach than the Assyrians and Babylonians had used. So the Assyrians do what? They impale people. Stick them on a stick till they die. Horrific. Babylonians say, we're just going to take all of you and we're going to move you someplace you've never lived before. And that's where you're going to live. The Persians come along and they say, you know what? People really don't like to get impaled. People don't really like to get moved away from their native country. So what we're going to do to have a happy, prosperous empire is we're going to let everybody go home. And that's what Cyrus does. He allows all these captive peoples, including the Jews, to return back to their countries. And he says to them, by the way, when you go, please go and build temples. And pray in your temples for the welfare of myself and the Persian Empire. The Cyrus cylinder is an artifact that gives tribute or gives understanding of what happens here with this policy. The policy is mentioned specifically in regards to the Jews in two biblical texts. Those two biblical texts, which we're not going to read, is 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 and 23. Also the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. Where the Bible writers write about what Cyrus is doing in relation to the Jewish people. Because when they're carried off to Babylon, God has told the Jews, you're going to be there for 70 years. The Persians then let them go home. This policy is also attested to in the archaeological record in the Cyrus cylinder. And this is the Cyrus cylinder there in that photograph. All right. It was excavated at Babylon in 1879. By a fellow whose name was Hormuz Rassam. It is housed, everybody wants to go to London now, don't you? All right. Housed at the British Museum. So if you want to see that, along with all those other things we've talked about, or a lot of them, you go to the British Museum in London. It is a foundation deposit, which was placed under Babylon's main temple. We do this as well, don't we? We build a new public building, what do? We put a time capsule in the cornerstone, don't we? And then 100 years later, everybody gets together and they break open the time capsule to see what the people put there 100 years earlier. This is a foundation deposit. That cylinder was never meant to see the light of day. It was meant to stay in the foundation under Babylon's main temple. But thankfully for us, it did not remain buried. The primary concern of the cylinder was Babylonia and what's going on there. There is no specific mention of the Jews. But it matches what we read about the Jews in the scriptures. The inscription reads this: I returned, and of course it's Cyrus here, the one talking. I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which had been ruins for a long time. The images which used to live therein and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. So Cyrus says what? Cyrus says, I'm the king. I want a prosperous empire. I've got these temples in Babylonia that have been destroyed. I've got the artifacts of those gods here. I'm going to send them back. Go back, rebuild the temples. And while you're there, pray for my welfare. Because in the ancient world, you believe in all the gods. So you want all the gods on your side. So that's what Cyrus does. In the biblical record, what we find is Cyrus telling the Jews, you go home. And when you get there, you build the temple. And oh, by the way, that's going to take a lot of money. Don't worry about that. We got you covered. We'll send some money with you so that you can do that. And oh, by the way, those Babylonians, they took all that stuff out of the temple back when they conquered the city of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Guess what? You can take that home as well. And when you get that temple built and you start making sacrifices again and you're praying to Jehovah, do what? Pray for my welfare. This was an empire-wide policy. It's here in the Cyrus cylinder, which again was meant to be buried. What's interesting, though, is that some proclamation tablets were discovered as well. They were deciphered in 2009. So again, really, really recently. In 2009, it was realized that the texts on these tablets are the same text as is found in the Cyrus cylinder. But these were not a part of a cylinder. They were meant to be displayed. So this policy of Cyrus, he puts it on a cylinder, he puts it in a temple or underneath the temple. And then he makes proclamations as well that are out there in public for anyone to read that says the same thing. 2009. You want to take a guess where they are? They're in the British Museum. The British went all over the world and gathered all sorts of stuff. So they uncover stuff like this. I don't know what it is, but it looks nice. Let's take it home. And years later, 2009, someone's got time. They're digging through the collection and they're deciphering the cuneiform. There's that writing again, that old form of writing. They're deciphering the cuneiform and they say, hey, that kind of sounds familiar. It's the same as on the Cyrus cylinder. What I want to impress upon you this evening is that, throat lozenge is gone, is that archaeology is not a dead science. Archaeologists are excavating all over the Middle East, excavating all over Israel. Some of the finds that we've looked at tonight, yeah, they're 150 years old. But some of them are really, really recent. And I would say that the more they uncover, the better we're going to understand that biblical world. So let's wrap this up a little bit. I wanted to say just some things in conclusion. There is a wide range of archaeological artifacts that pertain to the Bible. Some of these are monumental. Think about the black obelisk. Think about the Lakish reliefs. They're monumental. They're big. That's why you go to the British Museum. There they are, so you can see them. You go to the Louvre. There they are. You can see them. Some of them are really, really simple. Think about Azariah. Living back in the final years of the kingdom of Judah, living his life, and he's sealing this letter or that letter with a clay seal. And 2,500 years later, they find it in an excavation. That's a pretty simple thing, and yet it sheds light on the biblical world. Sometimes these things confirm details and events described in the Bible, but what they always do is they always illuminate the biblical world. We learn more about the world of the Bible through these artifacts than we would understand if we didn't have them. One thing that I make a point of saying when I teach the cultural world of the Bible, that class, is that we are so far removed. I had a lesson here on Sunday morning recently, last Sunday morning as a matter of fact, on sheep. Raise your hand if you have ever raised a sheep. Okay, I've got several hands out there that have raised a sheep. How many of you have ever raised 100 sheep? Okay. Most of the rest of us, we don't know sheep. Except that they taste good when they're cooked in a slow cooker, maybe. Okay? It's going to say no. Okay. I guess it's an acquired taste. And yet the Bible says so much about sheep that to understand the Bible, sometimes we just have to go back in time. We have to understand that that culture and that world is not our world. It is as foreign to us as it would be if we could transport Jeremiah to today. What in the world would he think about television? What would he think about cell phones? Raise your hand if you are here tonight and you are under the age of 25. Oh, I know there are more of you out there. Do you remember a world without email? You don't. I do. Do you remember a world without cell phones, TikTok, and Facebook? To our under 25? Probably not. The world changes rapidly. The culture that we live in changes as well. They would have a difficult time understanding us as we would have a difficult time understanding them. Archaeology helps us to understand that world better. That's archaeology and the Bible this evening. I don't know whether I'll get to continue this some point down the road, whether we're going to talk about that other stuff that I wanted to talk about. Ran out of time. I'm looking at my watch. What time is it? It is... it's 8 o'clock almost, so I'm glad I didn't add anything else in there. There wouldn't have been time for it. We got about 5 minutes left before we finish officially. So if there are some questions or comments out there this evening, this would be a time to raise your hand. Caleb back there will bring a mic so that we can hear your question. If there are not any questions or comments, we will finish like 3 minutes early. Okay? And by the way, if you need to leave, I understand that. Feel free to do that. We will not consider it rude, okay?
Just a few things on the Jericho discoveries. It's my understanding that the only ancient reference or record to Jericho is the Bible, and they got it right. Is that your understanding too? I know you're not an expert, but
I'm not sure that I would say, if you mean in scriptural reference, like written reference?
Any ancient record?
I don't know of any off the top of my head, but that is not a question I particularly researched. So I really couldn't speak authoritatively one way or the other.
Yeah,
it is a very old city.
Yeah, supposedly it's the oldest, but ancient experts I've listened to, they make that point. I thought it was kind of unique for the Bible to... It's the only record that mentions it, ancient record that mentions it, and they got it right. So, also, on the storage jars with the grain, just another significant point. The attack from Israel was only 7 days, but the grain being left in the jars, if it was not there, it would be a long siege because they would have used the food in the city, but there was food there, which points to a short siege, as the Bible describes it. So just a little side note. Yeah, usually in the ancient world, if a city was besieged, one of two things happened. Either they breached the walls and got into the city. That was usually the goal, or the city starved. Okay? Some sieges were very, very long. The siege of Jerusalem in 586 was 18 months. All right. By the time 18 months had ended, there were no food supplies in the city of Jerusalem. People were starving to death. The fact that there is grain in the cities, as you've said, is confirmation that the siege did not last long. They only march around it 7 days, and then they take the city. So it's confirmation of that, and plus what we talked about, that they didn't take the food. And just one more thing on the walls. They fell forward to the ground. But an attack you would think normally an attack goes into the city, so you would expect the walls to go inwards. Do you think there's some significance there with the walls coming out?
Yeah, there really is, and I'll tell you that I'm for those of you who don't know, I'm 54, and for 54 years of my life, well, let's say 44, because I probably don't remember anything before I was 10, remember being told the walls fell out. That's what the text of the Bible says. I taught Joshua and Judges and Ruth a quarter ago. And we got to that point in the class and noticed something interesting that I had never noticed before. And that is that the Bible doesn't say they fell outward. It says they fell flat. Which, by the way, is what we see in the photographs. Those are mud brick walls that have fallen flat. And that allowed the Israelites to then go over it. Actually, the text never says they fell outward.
Actually, one expert, at least one expert, maybe two experts I know of, they say the Hebrew can be translated, instead of walls fell flat, it can be translated as walls fell beneath itself, which you think about, well, how could that be? Well, that upper wall fell down towards the retainer wall. So it kind of formed a ramp because they went up into the city. But just a little side note.
Yeah, I have not found commentaries that would indicate that the Hebrew had that meaning. I'm not arguing that it could have that meaning. But definitely what we see in the archaeological record is we don't see walls falling inward. Okay? When they fall flat and there's a ditch there, then they fall flat and they're going to fall out and make that ramp. And by the way, they fall all around the city so that Israel can go up from every direction. Usually when a city is besieged in the ancient world, they make a breach in one place, maybe two. They don't destroy the walls all the way around the city. So Jericho's unique from that standpoint. Kayla, would you bring the mic up here to this gentleman? He's going to bring the mic. We need that because everybody needs to hear your question.
Well, they often say that that's what shows a miracle in that the way that they feel.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. From a standpoint of someone who believes the scripture that it's God doing that Israel has not done anything except do what God told them to do, absolutely it's miraculous. This is not what you'd expect to see. And it's not what you see when you excavate other cities that have been destroyed in this way as a siege. Yeah. Very, very unique. Okay. Well, we're at right about 8 o'clock. I want to say thank you to everybody for coming out. I know it's Saturday night. I know the weather is beautiful out there, and you've chosen to come out here this evening and sit and listen to me gab for about 2 hours, and I appreciate you doing that. If you got some questions or comments that you'd like to address with me, I'm going to stick around for a little while. I'm not going to run out the back door unless you're throwing rocks at me, in which case I will run. But hopefully you're not doing that. But if you'd like to talk with me, feel free to do that. I will tell you that this is a lecture format, but we are otherwise a church. So if you are looking for some place where you can go and maybe worship God, we would love to have you come back and visit with us here at North Beach. I am, again, the minister here, and so you'll see me again in the pulpit if you thought I gabbed too much tonight. I'm not always in the habit of doing that, but sometimes I do. But we'd love to have you come back and visit with us again. We will probably do another lecture in the fall. I don't see any reason why we would not do that. Don't know yet what the topic is going to be. Probably something along these lines that are kind of hopefully of general interest to folks. So again, once again, thank you for coming out this evening, and hope to see you all again.